We have Eric Suderth with us. Eric just finished his dissertation at MIT, and now he's at University of Berkeley, California at Berkeley. He's working there with Mike Jordan and Stuart Russell. Eric is responsible for a number of interesting innovations in machine vision, including non-parametric belief propagation, which is an idea that he's put a little bit on hold and won't be talking about today, but maybe we'll have him back to talk about that. He's going to talk today primarily about his work on hierarchical object appearance models using Dirichlet processes.
Okay, thanks, Tom. Thanks for having me here today.
You are. Okay.
Everyone hear me okay? Yeah? Okay, good. Yeah, okay. So as Tom said, I'm now at UC Berkeley. Most of what I'm going to be talking about today is actually work from the sort of latter year and a half of my thesis at MIT, although at the end I'll give a few hints about some things I'm thinking about over the last 6 months. And so I'm interested in object categorization. So how can we take images and recognize bicycles and llamas and cannons and separate these from all the other categories we interact with on a daily basis? And so I'm not interested in recognizing particular object instances. I want to see generalize from a small number of examples of, say, bicycles to other bicycles that I've never seen before and still be able to do recognition accurately. And so I'm going to describe a set of models that allow me to learn appearance of objects from few training examples. And I'm going to do this by hierarchical models. Hierarchical is going to be in the sense of sort of kind of a conceptual hierarchy, getting into coarser scales that let me transfer knowledge among object categories. And I'm going to take something from the non-parametric statistics literature called the Dirichlet process, which is going to let me avoid making sort of very restrictive assumptions about what the different stages in this hierarchy should look like and learn more from training data. Of course, in applications, though, we're usually not interested in recognizing isolated objects. We have a scene which had lots of different things in it. And in the literature, there's, I would say, two main approaches to taking sort of object recognition systems and mapping them into scene analysis. The first is what I'll call the sliding window approach, where you've trained some classifier that maps a little rectangular window into a sort of yes-no object present-absent decision. You slide this window over the image until you find a location at which you think the object is there. And of course, you're going to have sort of lots of different detections. Usually, there'll be several kind of partially overlapping in the regions of objects. And then there's some post hoc processing that goes on to prune those out. A second approach is what I'll call a greedy feature extraction approach. So you look over the whole image, you find your best hypothesis for what the object is. Then you take the pixels or features or whatever your representation is, you pull out that part of the image, and then you look around for your second best hypothesis. And then you repeat this process until there's no hypotheses left which are sort of sufficiently good. And I'm going to sort of take a different approach in this talk. I'm going to try to build models that think of scenes as a whole. So a scene is a collection of objects, which are in turn a collection of parts. And then these parts are finally going to be related to features. So for me, features are going to be things that I can actually measure from the image in a low-level fashion. And the parts and objects are going to be things I'm going to learn about that let me interpret those features. And I think there's a number of reasons why you get a lot of benefit out of thinking about scenes in this sort of more integrated way. And I'll come back to some of those issues later in the talk. So there's going to be two halves to this talk. The first is I'm going to focus not on scenes, but on just individual isolated objects. And let me talk about ways of building representations that share information among different object categories. In the second part of the talk, I'm going to return to multiple object scenes and describe a set of part-based models. First in sort of just a simple 2D representation, and then moving into more 3D representations of the visual world. So I imagine we have a kind of varied background in the audience, so please don't hesitate to ask me questions if I've failed to explain something or if there's a piece of background information I'm assuming that you don't know. Okay. So part-based models have a really, really long history in the vision literature, both in the computer vision and human vision communities. So some of the oldest ones, if you go back to 1973, on what were called pictorial structures, sort of mass and spring models for the appearance of objects. A lot of things more recently. Constellation models are essentially a sort of a probabilistic retelling of this pictorial structures. There's other things like people use support vector machines, discriminative methods, things that integrate models with segmentation, dozens of other papers that I haven't listed up here. So there's a big, big literature. And I'm going to have my own notion of parts, which we think has some both conceptual and computational advantages. But in all of these models, all these part-based models, one of the first issues you come across is, well, how many parts should I use to describe my object? What's the right level of granularity or detail? And if I wanted to recognize just a particular object, say just this particular elephant, then maybe the answer is as many parts as possible. I should use as many as I can. But really, we're interested in recognizing from seeing a few elephants I've never seen before. And so it's no longer clear what the right level of detail is. What are features that are particular to this specific elephant? What are things that are going to generalize? And then, of course, when I start thinking about scenes containing multiple objects, then this question of how many objects are out there in the world is really the fundamental issue I care about. This is really, in some sense, what I want my machine vision system to answer. So it becomes important to think about this uncertainty in the number of how many objects or how many parts are out there. So before I get into the details of how we solve that, I'm going to make a sort of initial transformation of the image that's going to make it easier to think of our models. And so we're going to take the images and extract a set of features in a low-level fashion. I'm using sort of what are now relatively standard methods in the literature to do this. So there's going to be a set of essentially corner features, what are called maximally stable regions. You can think of this as just sort of large regions that are relatively homogeneous in appearance. There's also edges. And if you look at these sort of the features for these different scenes, you can see they kind of capture complementary aspects of the visual world. And so the goal here is not to sort of do a lot of compression. We're taking lots and lots of features. And we're hoping we're not throwing away too much information by going to this feature representation. But rather, it's just to try to get some invariance to scale, lighting, pose, those sorts of variations, and also make it a little easier to build up models at higher levels. Okay. And we also need a way of describing the appearance of these features. And so I'm, again, going to use something that's relatively standard that David Lowe has proposed called the SIFT descriptor. If you haven't seen SIFT, the idea is pretty simple. I'm going to take a bunch of sort of derivative filters, apply them to my image. I'm going to compute histograms of the response of those filters. So how much orientation energy is there at different angles? And then I'm going to take these and map them to this big histogram. And then to do a little extra dimensionality reduction, we're going to take these raw SIFT histograms, which are 128 dimensional vectors, and vector quantize them. So use k-means, map them down to on the order of, say, about 1,000 visual words. Okay? So this is a terminology that others and I have used is sort of by analogy with work that's gone on in the text literature. By taking these continuous descriptors, doing this quantization, you get this sort of, each little patch in the image goes to, say, 1 of 1,000 different words in your vocabulary. And so some of the models I'm going to use are actually generalizations of things that have been used before in the text analysis community. So at the bottom here, this is just to give you some intuition for what these visual words look like. I took all of the features in all of these images, and I've mapped them to their closest visual word. And here, each color corresponds to a different visual word. And these are the visual words that tend to line up most with computer screens in a data set of office scenes. As you can see, there's some repeatability. You have these purple features that tend to show up on the upper left, and there's these green ones that tend to show up on the lower right. But they're certainly not perfect. There's a lot of noise. There's a lot of sort of extra detections. And the unfortunate thing is that any time you try to do low-level feature detection and make decisions, is the feature there or not, you're always going to have a lot of noise, no matter how carefully you tune your thresholds. So one of our goals is to build higher-level models that are going to be robust to this sort of variation. Okay, so I'm going to start off with a sort of simple generative model. So think of this as a 3-part model for a bicycle, and then I'm going to elaborate on it. And the way a generative model is going to work is that in each image, I'm first going to sample a reference position. So this is just going to model the fact that I don't know where the bicycle is located in the frame. It depends on where I pointed the camera when I took the image. So here it happened to be at the bottom. There it was at the top. Then for each feature, there's going to be a 2-stage process. I'm going to sample one of the parts of that object. And then given that part, I'm going to sample a feature location, so a position on the object where that feature is. And there's two parts to a feature. There's an appearance, which I'm not explicitly showing here, and also a position where I found it in the image. And so you think of these red dots as the position of the features. For the second feature, I repeat the same process. I randomly choose a part. Condition on that part, I choose a feature. So I might choose the same part twice, or I might choose a different part. Okay? And so I repeat this process, and I generate a whole collection of features. Okay? So each part is generated to a randomly sized set of features that are in the actual observed image. And so there's been several previous models that have tried to sort of have defined what they called a part and associated each part with one feature in the image. So like the constellation model, for each part, there's one feature which may or may not be observed. And in practice, those models are sometimes fragile. And so the way that our model associates parts with collections of features is really motivated by trying to do a little more pulling of information to avoid noise in that low-level feature extraction process. Okay. So if I fix the reference position in that generative process I just described, what I have is just a finite mixture model. So there's a probability of each part or mixture component. And then condition on that part, I have a probability of feature position, which is, for us, going to be a Gaussian, with the mean shifted by the reference position. So that's what captures how the object translates around. And also a distribution over the appearance of the feature. And since, remember, we did this vector quantization to map appearance to visual words. So this is just going to be a multinomial distribution. It says, this word appears 3% of the time, this word 5%, this word 0.5% of the time, so on. OK, but now I have this model. Again, the question is, how many parts should I choose? What's the right number? Right, because I don't have a model for, k is just a fixed parameter at this point. And if I use too few parts, that's going to make an inaccurate model. If I use too many, that's going to have overfitting. I'm going to generalize poorly to new examples. So you sort of want a way of choosing k that trades off these goals. And so we've looked at something called the Dirichlet process, which comes from the non-parametric Bayesian statistics literature. And essentially, it sort of tries to sidestep this whole model selection issue entirely. It says, OK, well, I'm not going to pick some finite number of parts. I'm just going to say there's going to be an infinite number of parts. But I'm going to put a prior on these weights, pi, the probabilities of these parts, that sort of encourages simpler models. I'm only going to use all those parts if I really have enough data to support it. And this prior has a pretty intuitive form. It's what's called a stick-breaking prior. So you can imagine I have all these weights for all the mixture components. And since it's a probability distribution, they have to sum to 1. So I'm going to start with a unit-length stick of probability mass. And then the first mixture component, I'm just going to take that stick and I'm going to break off a random proportion of it. Okay, so pi1 is going to be some random piece of the stick. And I'm going to draw that from a beta distribution, which is a standard distribution on the unit interval. So now I have some smaller part of the stick left. Again, I'm going to draw another beta random variable and break off some random proportion of that. So that'll give me a second weight, pi2. But now I have this yet smaller piece of stick remaining. So now I, again, draw a random proportion, get a third mixture component, and so on. And so you can see that over time, I have less and less of the stick left. So on average, these mixture components are decreasing. And so if I sort of pick any sort of significance level, say I'm interested in the mixture components that generate more than, say, 0.5% of the probability mass, there's going to be some small randomly sized subset of this full mixture weights that do it. Okay? OK, so now I come back to my model of objects. I have exactly the same thing I had before, except now there's an infinite set of parts. And I'm going to put this Dirichlet process prior on the mixture weights. Okay? And now I'm going to, it turns out when you start thinking about building hierarchical models that relate multiple objects together, it's a nice way of thinking about this not as a mixture model, but as a distribution. So think of these parts are defined by parameters, right? There's some mean and covariance for this Gaussian. And then there's the parameters of my multinomial distribution. And these are what encode the distributions on visual features. Okay? And now each object is just a distribution on these infinitely many potential part parameters. So for each object, there's a collection of parameters, the parameters of each part. And then for each part, there's some weight saying, which parts are more and less important to the features you actually observe from the object. So now I can take what I had before and I can write it down. Yeah. The previous slide? You're saying the word object as distribution should be object categories as distributions, or? Sure, yes. Yes, a number of times I'm going to use, I'll just say object, and I implicitly mean object category, not object instance. Yeah. Yeah.
So whenever the first part is going to get longer weight, how do you decide which parts get which weight?
So there's going to be a learning process, which is going to infer the weights. This order, it doesn't matter, because the model is invariant to essentially the fact that a part is part 5, so if you think of a finite mixture model, right, I have, I could arbitrarily permute the fact that this one mixture component is number 3 in my code and one is number 17 in my code doesn't matter. I could always just kind of permute those around. And so what the stick breaking prior does is it's a sort of mathematical tool. You're right that on average the first one's going to be bigger. And what the learning process is going to do is it's simultaneously going to be learning what the weights are and also what the parameters are. And so it's going to put the parameters that are important in earlier parts of this order. If that makes sense. So you can write the same generative model down in terms of a graphical model or directed Bayesian network. So I have this G is this distribution that defines what my object category looks like. So it's this collection of part parameters and also the probability pi for each one. Then for each image, I'm going to sample a reference position, a location of the object for that particular image. So this, if you haven't seen this plate notation, this J just means I make J copies of these random variables. So I have J images. Each one, I pick one reference location. Then for each feature, each of the N features in that image, I'm going to first sample a set of part parameters. So I'm going to, when I draw a sample from G, I take the full set of potential parts and I pick out one, make a copy of its parameters. And then condition on that, I'm going to sample a feature appearance, which is going to be from a multinomial distribution, and a feature position, which is from a Gaussian. So if you haven't seen graphical models before, this is surely not helpful to you. And this is exactly equivalent to that generative process I drew in pictures several slides ago with the bicycle. Okay, but for those who have seen the math before, this is sort of more formally what the model looks like. Okay. So one of the issues with these big hierarchical models is how am I going to learn them from data? You know, I have parameters. There's a worry that it's going to be hard to specify them. And one of the nice things about Dirichlet processes is that they have a lot of nice analytic structure that's going to let me develop fairly simple learning algorithms that work efficiently. And so the sort of simplest algorithm you can think about for these things is what's called a Gibbs sampler, where I'm going to sort of sample a set of variables, sample from the posterior distribution of a set of variables, given all the data I've observed. And turns out there's a relatively small set of things I need to sample. I'm going to sample for each image the reference transformation. So I'm going to be trying to guess where the object is located. And for each feature, I'm going to sample an assignment, which you can think of as a pointer, which says, OK, for this feature, which part do I come from? I come from part 5 or part 17 or part whatever. So I'm going to sample these sort of discrete pointer variables for each feature. Given these, I can integrate over this distribution that defines the object thing, so the actual part parameters and their weights, and also this prior distribution on transformations in closed form. So if you haven't seen this before, this is a really neat trick. It's called Rao-Blackwellization. You can prove nice things about this, what this does to your learning process. And I think it's this sort of way of sampling a small set of things and then analytically just marginalizing away the rest is really a sort of nice practical tool for making samplers work. And then finally, there are a small set of hyperparameters, which fortunately turn out to be easy to deal with. So there's a prior on the transformations, which essentially just encodes the image scale. So what coordinate system have I defined my axes on? It's easy to set. There's another, you have to set a prior which says roughly how large do I expect my parts to be, what percentage of the image, as well as how sparse do I expect these visual feature distributions to be. So on average, should for a given part put weight on 10% of the vocabulary or 5%? So there's essentially one scalar that tells you that. And then it's fairly insensitive to those. The one that matters the most is actually what's called the concentration parameter. So this was, if you remember that stick breaking process, there's a number which says, on average, how big are my pieces of the stick? So you can imagine this affects how many parts I end up thinking I find. And it turns out that rather than fixing this, what you can do is instead put a prior on it. So we put a fairly vague, dispersed prior on this and sample it as part of the learning process. And there's a literature on ways of doing this. And I found in practice it works quite well. Sort of an anecdote, as you can imagine, when I started working with this, before I got the full model working, I was sort of fixing things like the concentration parameter. And I spent a few months trying to tune it as well as I could. Then I got around to implementing the thing that resamples it automatically. And the first run did better than I'd ever managed to tune it myself. So it actually, I was pleasantly surprised by how well that worked. So one way to get intuition from the model is just now we can look at a single object category. So I have a set of frontally aligned faces from the Caltech database. And one of the properties of this stick breaking prior, which is maybe not obvious from that one slide I gave you, but if you look in the literature, there's nice ways of understanding it, is that as you get more data, it expects to see more and more components. So it expects the number of the complexity of your model to grow at a slow rate with the amount of data you observe. So if I give it 4 images, at the top row I've shown the set of parts created by the model. So these are like Gaussian distributions. These are the covariance ellipses of Gaussians. And this is with 4, 16, and 64 training images. So you can see as I get more and more data, it starts off making a sort of relatively coarse decomposition of the space. And then it makes a sort of finer and finer grained decomposition, creating additional parts to describe more structure. And so in this upper left corner, that plot is showing the mean and variance of the number of parts that it creates as a function of the amount of training data it observes. And these, unfortunately, these are hard to see in the projector here. These are just segmentations showing which features are being mapped to which parts in the explanation process. But the top row I think gives a better sense for what the decomposition is doing. Yes?
Can you remind us what the form of the calculation is? How many subjects, how many data sets are?
This is an old database, right? So this is 4 images that look kind of like this, and this is 60. And even with 64 images, there were some overlap of the subjects. There might be 20 unique people, and several of them had different pictures taken in different environments. It's not. This particular data set is not considered to be anything that's interesting for test purposes. I just used it here because it gives you some intuition for what the learning process does. Okay. But that's a single object category. And remember, we're interested in recognizing lots and lots of different objects. So suppose, hypothetically speaking, that you'd taken the time to collect a whole bunch of images of llama faces. And so you have a world-class llama face detector. And now I show you an example of this new animal, a cow. You've never seen one before. It's your first cow. Does the fact that you know lots and lots about llamas, does that make it any easier to recognize other cows? Do I have to start from scratch with each new category? I hope I don't have to start from scratch, right? Because it varies depending on who you talk to, but humans can recognize something on the order of 10 or 20,000 object categories. And so if I really have to get hundreds of examples for every object category I ever want to learn about, that's a tall order. And so you really like it to be the case that if I've learned a lot about some category and then I show you a few examples of something that's related, you can generalize well. And there's lots of ways of thinking about doing this generalization. And one that we've explored is by essentially, it comes from the observation that if you look at objects, although they're globally different in appearance, often they're sort of local subregions that look relatively similar. So noses and wheels are sort of relatively stereotypical, but this really shows up in sort of lots of other cases in terms of contours and corners and small textured patterns and so forth. And so the idea is we're going to try to learn parts of objects that are shared across categories. And of course, here we really can't afford to manually have to label all the parts and how they correspond. That's just not feasible. So we really need a way of automatically discovering how many parts should there be, what patterns should they be shared across the categories. And the nice part about the Dirichlet process is that it's fairly easy to put an extra level on the hierarchy and get this sharing. And so the way the model works is we're going to have a sort of global set of parts. So you can think of this as there's a global bag of parts, and then when I make an object category, I go in this global bag and I take out some subset of those. And those are the parts that compose that object. And then the second object category, you're going to pull out some different subset. So to pick an example, it might be the case that when I go to compose bicycles and cannons, that there's a wheel part that's shared between them, and there's some other parts that aren't shared. Now, given these parts at this level for the objects, the rest of the generative model is exactly like I had before. For each image, we sample a location for the object, and then we generate a collection of features. Okay? So there's just this extra level at the top, which says that if I have 5 categories, they're not just 5 independent sets of features. I actually expect 5 independent sets of parts, excuse me. I expect there to be some sharing of those parts across categories. Okay. And so if you sort of take away all of the continuous position portion of this model, so get rid of the reference transformation, and you have not features that only have a visual word, which is the same as you would have if you just took a text document and scrambled the order and just had a bag of words, you get something called the hierarchical Dirichlet process, which UIT, Mike Jordan, and collaborators developed a few years ago for the analysis of text data. So we've added the pieces into this that you need in order to really model the sort of spatial structure you have in visual scenes. Okay. So to test this, I wanted to look at a set of object categories where there was some hope that sharing parts among them would provide benefit. So we put together a data set with 16 categories. There's sort of 7 animal faces, 5 animal profiles, and 4 sort of things with wheels, vehicles, whatever you want to call them. And so now each training image is labeled with which of these 16 categories it's a member of. The model, we're not going to tell the model about this sort of coarser level grouping that I've written down here. As far as the learning process knows, it's just a set of 16 categories. And so one of the questions is whether it's going to automatically uncover some of this structure that there's some categories that are more similar when sharing and defining parts. I'll give you a little intuition for what the parts that it learns looks like. Remember, each part has 2 things. It has a distribution over feature positions, which is a Gaussian. So here I've plotted this Gaussian. Think of this as being relative to the center of the object. Okay? So this is where features of this part show up. And there's also this position distribution, which is a little hard. It's this distribution on vector quantized SIF descriptors that lives in this high dimensional space. It's a little hard to visualize directly. So what I've done is I've taken all the features in all these images, and I've mapped each feature onto the part that's most likely to have generated it. And so you can see that in this case, essentially this part seems to be generating features that show up around the wheels of these vehicle categories. Here's another example of features that essentially seem to show up around the mouth regions of the different animal categories. Okay. Another thing we get is that the learning process recognizes that, well, around the edges of the image, you tend to have these this background texture that's not very predictable. It's not very correlated with the object category. So you get these kind of very elongated parts that are sort of widely shared among the categories. So you can think of this as I didn't actually expect this when I first implemented it, but we're getting some additional leverage of the sharing by saying that, well, when I want to estimate what background clutter looks like, I can pool information across the categories rather than having to treat each category separately. So one way of visualizing what we've learned is, that was 3 parts. With 30 training images per category, I think we learn about 150 or 200 parts, maybe 150. And so one way of sort of putting that all together is to say that, well, so each object is defined by a distribution over these parts. So I can look at pairwise distances between those distributions. So we use just a symmetrized KL divergence. And then I use multidimensional scaling to map those distances into the two-dimensional plane. So in this plane, each point corresponds to an object category. Points that are nearby share a lot of parts. So they're sort of close in this metric. Points that are far in Euclidean distance here have a large distance in terms of their part probabilities. So they don't have much overlap in the parts they use. And you can see some fairly natural groupings. So you have all of the faces over here on the left side, and even within the faces, you have the more elongated ones and the cat faces separated. You have the profiles here and the vehicles with wheels up here. Another way of looking at that same data is to do a sort of bottom-up agglomerative clustering. So you pairwise merge, and you get what's called a dendrogram, which, again, sort of tells you about their split. And you see that there's sort of 4 main clusters in the sharing. So again, we have the sort of bodies of some of the animals. We have things with wheels. We have some 2 sets of faces. And then in this case, the wheelchair and the llama body really didn't share much at all with any of the other categories. So to get a more quantitative analysis, we looked at 2 tasks. So in the first detection task, I give you a test image, and you have to tell me, is it object category or is it sort of just background? So I have this sort of data set of natural scenes background images, and you have to decide which one of these 2 it is. And so here are ROC curves for that detection task. So the first thing to notice is, the 2 blue lines correspond to models which share parts. The 2 green lines correspond to models which don't share parts. So I build an independent part-based model of each category. So you can see I get a pretty significant boost in performance by sharing parts among categories. And another interesting thing is that, so the solid line is the full model I've described. The blue dashed line is a simple, what's called a bag of features model, where I throw away the positions of the features and I just model their appearance. Okay? And this is something that several people have looked at before me, or different variants of these bag of features models. And so you can see that you get a significant boost in performance by considering the spatial structure, not just the appearance, but only if I share parts among categories. So if you look at the 2 green lines, the green dashed line is actually higher than the green solid line. So it appears that there's some overfitting going on, that if I only have 6 training images per category and I try to model feature positions of each category independently, I actually do worse than if I threw those away, but not if I share images.
Is this a pure use one?
Yeah, right. So here's area under ROC curves as a function of the number of training images. So if you look at the 2 green curves, they cross at somewhere between 12 and 15 images per category. But even out to 30 images per category, you can see the best performance of the unshared models is still quite a bit worse than the best performance where I share parts among categories.
So do you have intuition for that?
What's going on?
Yeah, so with your first graph, it looks like, well, you're learning the background, and you don't have enough images, so you overfit.
Right.
But I'm not sure about this graph.
I think there's still I think you're just even, so 30 images is not a large enough data set that you don't have idiosyncrasies, right? So you may have in your 30 training images of cougar faces, you may have not gotten one where he was opening his mouth in a particular way, right? Maybe they all had closed mouths, but maybe you had a cat image or one of the other categories that had his mouth open in that way. Or maybe there was something with the shadows and things. I think that just kind of, it gives you a little bit of extra, it regularizes the learning process, but in a nice way, in a way that doesn't, it's not me having to set very strong priors and hand tune them, it's just kind of sharing information across data, across things. And so, And so, I mean, this is really the thing that makes, this is why sort of Bayesian hierarchical models are useful. I would say the single biggest thing that gets you is that there's a lot of applications in statistics where you have a bunch of groups of data, and you expect them to be related, sort of similar, but not exactly the same. And the simplest way to deal with that is to make them all independent, or stick them all in one group, say they're exactly the same. And with hierarchical models, you can do something that's in between. You can say they're going to be similar, so they're related, but not the same. And the hierarchical Dirichlet process is a particularly nice way of doing this because you don't have to make strong assumptions about the form that similarity should take. And another benefit, I think, is that so you get simpler, more compact models by sharing. So here I'm showing the number of parts that I create as the amount of training images per category. And the green line up there is for independent models of the 16 categories. This blue line is with shared parts. So not only am I doing better in performance, I have 150 or 100, sorry, about 130 parts instead of 450. And when it comes down to test time, everything that you do with these models the cost is linear in the number of parts. So looking at a test image, deciding what category it is, runs about 3 times faster with the shared model. And you can see, if you look at the slopes of these lines, if you went out to a bigger data set, I expect that you would probably get larger gains. But so the thing that you might worry is that by sharing parts among object categories, I reduce my ability to distinguish between them. And so to test that, we looked at a case where you have to make a decision: is it the object category or one of the other 15 categories that were trained on jointly? And it turns out in this case that yes, at least with this sort of simple form of sharing, you get a small loss in recognition performance. So here the green line is an independent model of each category, and the blue line is where I share parts. And you can see that there's a small gap between them there. Now, if you look at it as function number of training images, there's a gap that stays there out to 30 images. The loss here is smaller than the gain you get on detection, but there is a loss. And as you might expect, these curves average across categories. And if you look more detailed, what's happening is what you would expect. So if I share parts, I do a better job at distinguishing cougars from bicycles, but I do a worse job at distinguishing cougars from cats, from very similar categories. And so this is, I think that there's probably a lot of other refinements you could do in terms of being richer about the way you share, maybe use a more discriminative training criterion that might, that if you're really interested in this categorization task, that might lessen this cost. Okay. So are there questions before I move on to the second? Yeah.
People that have discriminative models, what happens if they both really find features or some of the features that you learn and train a discriminative model?
You mean so the question is, what's the final performance relative to a discriminative model?
Right. How difficult is that?
I'm not sure on the 16 category data set. Later on, I'm going to show some results on analyzing street scenes. And so we looked at a basic sort of boosting car detector, compared how that worked to our performance at finding cars, and they were basically the same. Which we're happy with as a first shot at this, because there's a lot more sort of engineering that's gone into those boosting detectors than this has thus far. So my sense is that you're not going to, at the moment, you're not, I think the real benefit from this is by, as you'll see later, it's easy for us to sort of think about partial supervision, very heterogeneous amounts of labeling at different parts of the learning process. And that's much harder to deal with discriminative learning. So that's the real hope with this, is that if you give it lots of data where you don't have a lot of labels, but you have a lot of unlabeled data, that maybe we'll be able to get some leverage out of that. And in fact, that's what this is right here. So, these are images from the Label Me data set, which Antonio Torralba, Brian Russell, and Bill Freeman have put together at MIT. It's a nice data set if you haven't seen it. So there's a web interface where you can go in, label images, give it whatever name you want to, and then you can, it's all free for download. I think there's tens of thousands of images, hundreds of thousands of labeled objects instances at this point. And so if you look through the data set, this is, I mean, this and any other data set like this I know of, this is kind of what it looks like, is there's a relatively small number of images where people have really gone in and labeled them in detail. So they kind of labeled all the objects that are present. There's a lot more images where they've done some partial labeling. So maybe they went after the cars, and here they did the road, and there they did the tree, but here they just did the cars. And so there's more like this. And then there's essentially a limitless supply of unlabeled images. More than, well, maybe Google could handle all of them, but more than I could ever handle to deal with computationally. So, and so this is really part of the reason of this hierarchical model is that we think that by thinking of scenes as sort of being integrated models with multiple objects, we're going to be able to do a lot better job of leveraging this kind of partially labeled data, right? This image doesn't just tell me, this should tell me more than what the car looks like in this narrow window, right? Because I have other cars, and there's foliage near them, and then that should give me other examples of learning what foliage is above that. So we'd like to build models that sort of do that automatically. And so a distinction I'm going to make in this latter set of models is that of separating object categories from visual categories. And so object categories I'm going to just define as something that we provide labels of. So I'm not going to be trying to sort of do everything fully unsupervised. For every object category that I want, say a computer screen or a bookshelf, I'm going to provide some labeled examples of it. But a lot of these object categories come in very different appearances. So like in our officing data set we'll consider later, there's bookshelves that hang on the wall and other bookshelves that sit on the floor. And we're not going to sort of make these sorts of distinctions manually. This is going to be discovered in unsupervised fashion. Okay. So when we look at multiple object scenes, then the question that comes up is, well, how many cars are there, and where are those cars located in the scene? And the way we're going to do this is by combining our earlier Dirichlet process models with spatial transformations. So you can think of these clusters or mixture components in the Dirichlet process are going to describe what the object looks like in a sort of canonical object-centered coordinate frame. What does it look like if it was right in the middle of the frame when I took my picture? And then I'm going to compose a scene by taking multiple objects and then moving them around to random locations. Okay? And so this notion of what we'll call spatial transformation just says I'm going to take this canonical object and move it into a different location. Okay? So this is an old idea in vision. There's been a lot of sort of things that have done this for things like analyzing video sequences. But we're going to do it in a sort of different way to try to do categorization of scenes. Okay. So to get some intuition from the model, we'll look at a toy world. So think of these as 2D images, and these are locations of features. And if you look at the different images, there's kind of two sorts of objects that show up in this world. There are these diagonal bars that are somewhere in the upper right part of the image. And then there are these blobs that show up sometimes in the lower left corner. Okay? And now the way that what we call the transform Dirichlet process works is that I'm going to have a global set of object categories. So those are these green ellipses. And there's going to be two parts. There's going to be a shape of the object. So that's the green ellipse. And then the red dash contour is my prior over transformation. So where does this object tend to show up? Okay, in different images. Then for each image, I'm going to take a random number of copies of that object and put them down at different locations. So here I might have put one copy of the bar. Here I put two. Here I didn't put any at all. Okay? And then given that, I'm going to generate a bunch of features that I actually observe. And so this notion of transformation, if you think about it's sort of obvious from the vision perspective, maybe not so obvious from the statistics perspective, but it's very important. And the reason is that if I take that data I gave you before, and I give it to the learning process for our transform Dirichlet process, then this is what you get. You get these two clusters. It says, oh, there's these blobs, they're these bars, and they show up in these 2 locations. And that's what you'd want. If I give the same data to the standard hierarchical Dirichlet process, which treats position as being defined in sort of an absolute coordinate frame, right? So the fact that I'm at pixel 265, that's somehow meaningful, okay? And you see what the hierarchical Dirichlet process has to do is it ends up creating an independent copy of the object for every location that it's been observed. So it's kind of discretizing the space of transformations. This is bad for a couple reasons. One is that it doesn't know that you could observe. So for example, if you look a little bit to the right there, it never happened to see a diagonal bar there. But it can't predict that that's likely to happen. So it can't generalize to new locations. Even worse is that when it's learning the appearance of each of these objects, it treats them all independently. So there's no pooling of information. Whereas this model is going to sort of, if it discovers multiple cars, it's going to say, aha, I can combine them together to get better appearance models. And that's going to be important for real data. OK, so now we come back to the scene. We have sort of candidate answers to these 2 questions. We're going to use Dirichlet processes to give us uncertainty in how many cars or objects are in the scene, and transformations to model the fact that I don't know where it happens to be located. So that previous slide I showed had a sort of overly simplified model of geometry. It was just sort of like each object is a single blob. Of course, objects actually have more internal structure. And so basically, we can combine that model I had before with the part-based model from the first part of the talk. So there's going to be a set of object categories, each of which is a collection of parts. So there's this blue category that has 1 part, the green that has 2, and the red that has 4 in this toy example. For each image, then I take a random number of copies of these objects, shift them around to different locations, and then, given that, I actually generate the features I observe in the scene. Okay. So you can generalize the Gibbs samplers that I told you about in the first part of the talk to this case. And if you give it a data set of street scenes, so the same ones I showed you earlier, where there were the 4 categories: buildings, cars, roads, and trees. These are the clusters it learns. So you can see that it's got this one sort of fairly compact cluster describing the internal structure of cars. There's a few different clusters for buildings, because buildings come in lots of different sizes and shapes depending on where they're located. So there's a sort of larger cluster here, sort of smaller one for smaller patches of building. You can again see for the road here, this cluster is trying to model the fact that roads tend to be this sort of fill up most of the bottom of the image when they observe. And then when it goes to analyze a test image, it takes these things and moves them around and tries to use them to partition up the features in a way that makes sense. So here's a sort of snapshot of what it might do on a test image. So in the middle row, I've taken each feature and I've colored it according to the object category with the highest posterior probability. So red is car, purple is building, blue is road, green is tree or foliage. The bottom row, here's a snapshot of the Gibbs sampler, what it's doing. So you can see in this image, it's put down 1 car cluster to explain the 1 car that's sort of fully observed there. And whereas here, it's put down several car clusters to capture the fact that there are several cars observed. So this is the way in which it's automatically accounting for the fact that I don't know how many cars are out there. This on the right, this is probably one of the worst images in the test set. I'm not going to give it credit for knowing that cars live in parking garages. And so there's a couple things going on for why it's messed up here. One is that this sort of light, dark pattern actually looks a lot like a car to the SIFT, to these gradient-based edge features that we have. And then another is that at the moment, this model doesn't have any sort of, doesn't capture contextual relationships between objects. So it doesn't know that cars don't float in the air above other cars. And so that's an obvious thing that you'd like to leverage in a scene model. And I'll come back to that a little later. You can do the same thing with, so this is just to give you sort of a baseline. This is if I just try to look solely at the appearance of features, don't do this classification with position, and the sort of performance I get. And if you look at ROC curves, so in all these curves, the black dotted line is appearance only, the solid line is the full model. So you get a fairly substantial gain in segmentation performance by considering. And then, of course, another nice benefit is that by this transfer Dirichlet process model can actually count how many objects it thinks are present in the scene. Whereas if I just use a bag of features model, that's impossible. I can try to segment features, but I don't have any notion of how many objects are contributing to those features. Okay. So how much time do I have left? Am I out?
Until 3, I guess.
Until 3. OK, I'll wrap up in the next minute or two. So one limitation of the model I just described is that it sort of composes scenes in a 2D fashion. It kind of moves things around in the plane and puts them together like a jigsaw puzzle. And we really like to sort of get closer to the 3D structure of scenes. And it turns out actually that it makes a lot of sense to consider 3D structure together with recognition. So for example, if I knew the 3D depths of points in the scene, then a lot of the sort of segmentation tasks, like separating this bookshelf from this table, which are very hard in the image, they become trivial. On the other hand, if I know what objects are present in the scene, that gives me a really strong cue for regularizing depth estimation and recovering 3D structure. So we think it makes sense to really think about these problems together. And so as a first shot of doing this, we looked at a data set of office scenes in which the 3 categories labeled. There's computer screens, bookshelves, and desks. To calibrate our model, we use stereo training images. So very simple idea for those who haven't worked with stereo. Have 2 cameras. If I take a picture at 2 points displaced, objects that are near me move a lot. Points off in the distance don't move at all. So you can get estimates of depth by finding point correspondences. So depth is inversely proportional to this horizontal displacement or disparity. It turns out that you can't really get good depth estimates greedily by looking at each feature. So if I just look at each feature and look along the epipolar line, which is the line in the corresponding image where its match has to lie based on the camera geometry, and I just greedily try to find the one whose appearance looks the most similar, this is the kind of depth estimate you get. So here, green points are close to you and red are far away. So you can see that there's a lot of noise right here. It's doing a pretty, and here's an overhead view of the same scene. So you can see like the features from the bookshelf, they're mostly in the right place, but there's a lot of outliers. Okay. So rather than doing this greedy depth estimation, what we're going to do is we're going to take a set of feature matches, convert them to these depth densities, saying some depths are more or less likely. And then we're going to run our learning process to try to figure out what objects are there and use objects to resolve these fuzzy depth densities into more precise estimates. So the way the model looks is now I have objects are a collection of parts that live in 3D. For each image, I'm going to take a random number of these parts and move them around to different locations. Then I'm going to generate a collection of features that live out in 3D. And finally, I'm going to observe the perspective projection of these features when I take a picture with a camera. And so I'm going to get scaling, sort of scale invariant recognition, not by resizing the image, which is a trick people commonly use, but by the actual sort of moving objects in 3D and perspective projection, which is, of course, how things work when you actually take a picture. So here's an example of if I first look at a constrained model where I only let myself create 1 part per object per visual category, this is what I get. So remember, there's a prior over transformations. I've placed each object down at its mean location. So this says if I look at an office scene where the camera's looking this way, there's typically the computer screens and desks tend to be near the front, and then there's bookshelves and background clutter farther away. And here you see with bookshelves, actually, it creates 2 visual categories. So the bookshelves that hang on the wall and ones that sit on the floor. So it automatically splits the observed data into those 2 groups. Here's a multiple part model. So if you look, you have a fairly intuitive model for what a computer screen looks like. So you have these nice collections of corners, and then there's also some other features that show up in the middle of the screen. Desk has these sort of horizontally elongated parts. The bookshelves are a little noisier. I think that's because there were maybe only 20 or 30 labeled examples of bookshelves in this particular data set we used. Okay. And now here's an example test image where now to interpret this scene, I'm moving objects around in 3D and placing them. And this is giving me cleaner depth estimates. So these are, you can quantify these. These are much more accurate than the ones I get by just looking at individual scenes. I also get segmentations of features into the different objects that are present, as well as this sort of rough 3D view. Here's another example. Again, it does reasonably well. You can see it's hallucinated a monitor in this sort of reflections in the window here. But overall, the interpretation is not bad. So those were stereo test images where I had 2 images at test time. A sort of harder problem is if I just give you 1 image at test time, can you still do depth reconstruction? And so with the current system, the stereo test works pretty reliably. Monocular test works sometimes. It's less reliable. So you can see here's an example where you get more false alarms. So here's an example where it hallucinates a monitor and is sort of as being off in the distance in these chords here, which wouldn't happen if you had the depth cues. And I think here's in a case where I think that context is going to play a really powerful role. Because if you look at this image and you ask, well, how do I know what the depth of this desk is in this scene? Just by looking at it. Because you can't see the edges of the desk. You don't know how big it is. Well, but you know that the monitor is sitting right on top of it. Right? So there's a lot of sort of contextual relationships that actually get messy when you think about things happening in the image that are pretty simple in 3D. And so we think it's going to be, that's something we'd really like to go to. And we've, in work that actually preceded the things I've talked about today, we looked at a parametric model, so you knew how many objects were in the scene. So like a scene was 1 keyboard, 1 computer screen, 1 mouse in an office. And there we were able to develop contextual cues that said, well, the keyboard is usually below the screen and the mouse is below and to the right. If you really care about finding something like a mouse that's small, doesn't generate many features, you do a lot better with this contextual model. Because it's easy to find the computer screen that tells you where to look. But at the moment, sort of generalizing this sort of model to this Dirichlet process context where you have have less global structure is an open problem. And more recently, we've been doing some work at Berkeley on wavelet statistics, sort of lower level models that try to get away from this feature extraction. I think I'll skip this in the interest of time, but if anyone would like to talk to me about it later, I'd be more than happy to. So I hope I've given you a hint of some of the things that you can do with these hierarchical Dirichlet processes. I think that they let you think about very flexible ways of transferring knowledge among object categories, robust ways of learning from small, partially labeled data sets, let you integrate sort of different things like recognition and reconstruction. And the thing I'm most excited about is that it's sort of hard to sort of take high-dimensional complex data like images and just feed it sort of as a black box into a non-parametric method, like a Dirichlet process. But if you really sort of think about your representations and how you structure the model, I think you can really scale these things to a lot more interesting problems. So, thanks.
Just curious, what is that a picture of on the bottom left?
Oh.
Was that part of your presentation?
That was one of the few slides I missed. So these are our wavelet or steerable pyramid coefficients. So these are joint statistics of pairs of coefficients. And these sort of bandpass representations of images. And so this is like 2 coefficients that are at a neighboring orientation, so saying that they're positively correlated. And this is sort of what happens as you go to different scales and positions and so on. And so the fact that these 2 rows look relatively similar says that our model is doing something interesting, because data sampled from our model looks like the statistics of images. And so to show the last slide out of order, so a sort of an initial test case of this that we've done is denoising. So you take this as an input image where you've added some fairly high-level Gaussian noise to it, and you want to try to uncover the denoised image. And so this is an example output of the method on that image, which is on par with current state-of-the-art methods. And so we've looked at this in this sort of image processing applications, and we think some of the same ideas may be useful also for more recognition, higher-level tasks.